A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Could be one of those days where you'll just lean in a little closer to the radio and pick up on some of the finer points of our fabulous history here in Australia. The good, the bad and the ugly perhaps, but it is fascinating to listen to stories. Well, we're coming back to the foundations of our nation today as we uncover those stories from our Australian Christian history. But it's all part of our Australian history, but our Christian heritage is so much all a part of that. We're going to get a focus today on some of the outstanding women who shaped Australia as a nation. How much do you know about the likes of Elizabeth Macquarie, or Caroline Chisholm, or Daisy Bates? Well, we're going to touch on those ladies, but we're also going to be talking about the Christian women who started the temperance movement to curb alcohol intoxication, and then went on to win the vote for women in Australia. Well, we're back today with historian and political strategist Dr. Christopher Reynolds. His outstanding book on Australia's history is called What a Capital Idea, Australia 1770 to 1901. As an historian, Christopher was first listed in the International Who's Who Historical Society back in 2006. He's published in politics, in business and education, and as a political strategist was even awarded a commendation from the former US President Ronald Reagan, having held White House appointments and worked for several US political campaigns. Christopher Reynolds, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Hey, Christopher, the book, and we've had a number of sessions now where we've been able to hear your, vibrant storytelling skills and reflecting on Australia's history. And you've had a number of incredible launch opportunities in various states right around Australia, some dignitaries involved in helping to launch the books. Give us a little, in a nutshell, of what's happened with your launches.
Well, the big one was in Sydney about 3 or 4 weeks ago with Tony Abbott. We were at the Royal Australian Automobile Club. Absolutely wonderful building with all these wonderful ancient, old, I suppose is the word, pictures, paintings of Australia. And you can only stand there in this beautiful downstairs room with the leather lounges. And, I could just imagine myself with a whiskey and a cigar sitting in this wonderful men's club, just pondering all these wonderful things. Anyway, the photographer took some great photos of Tony and I standing in front of this a diagram of a boat, a ship. Well, it turned out to be the original diagram of the Endeavour. And I'm absolutely amazed in this room. But Tony was great, and I was on the ball and on the microphone. There were more people with AOs than BOs in the room that day, chandeliers and the rest. So I was a bit nervous about it all. But in the end, Tony was very impressed with the book, and we never got to eat lunch. We sat there, and he just talked about the book. And eventually he said, you ought to eat some lunch. I said, I don't usually eat lunch. To which he laughed, and he doesn't eat it either. But we just talked the whole time. And then he got up, but he ended up with saying about how marvellous the book is. And he finished up by saying, God bless Australia, and God bless Chris Reynolds for writing this marvellous book. Remember that he's a strong Catholic. And so him reading from my perspective, of what Christians did in this country, was as important to him as it is to me.
Because we can get into a conversation, can't we, about this divide between Protestants and Catholics, and to reflect from what leaders are saying about the book, because when you write Christian, are you always differentiating between Protestant and Catholic? Because sometimes we think about an evangelical Christian history. Sometimes there are those who are going to reflect on those who've had Catholic faith. We'll group them all under Christian, won't we?
Oh, of course. I mean, what am I? What am I? Well, my name is Reynolds of the clan Reynolds of the MacDonalds in Scotland. And I went up to where the family all came from in Scotland, and I talked to the priest there. And he said, his language was much more colourful than what I can repeat. But the priest actually said, we'd get upset with the Stuart Kings at one stage, and at one point, even the priest said, "That's it, we've had enough," and 400 people got in a boat and just paddled across to Ireland, because we don't realise how close the connection was. And so in Ireland, of course, my name is Reynolds, And I've been to where my family came from in Ireland, took my 3 sons, and we walked around this place called Mull Hill, which is between Sligo and Galway, next to Roscommon. And here we were in this little town on a Sunday, Easter Sunday. And I'll tell you 2 funny stories. One is I walked the boys around the graveyard, and even Michael saw his own grave 9 times. Here lies Michael Reynolds, and here lies another Michael Reynolds, because it was Reynolds County. And I ran into the fellow that owned the pub at the bottom of the street, and on this cold day, and the boys standing there with me, and his name was Chris Reynolds, right? So the old Chris Reynolds took us upstairs, and he said, when I bought the pub in the 1960s or something, there were 23 pubs in this one little town on this hill, massive cathedral at the top of the hill, and all of them were owned by a Reynolds. So we were home. There was no doubt about it with this. So that's the Catholic side. But my parents did an unforgivable thing in those days. She was Anglican, and they married, and one lot of the family wouldn't come to the wedding, But so there's some history in the division that goes back, but not these days. The Catholic understand themselves fully and will pronounce that they are Christian, and in many ways they are sticking to the original understanding of our faith, that the Lord's Prayer, the Confession, the Nicene Creed. They pray for forgiveness, and many new churches are throwing, as it were, I don't want to say the baby out of the bathwater, but that's what I mean, that we've become so modern that we're forgetting our roots, where, of course, so I enjoy, so I've had a mixed background. I spent a lot of time on the Methodist.
It's not a topic for our conversation today, but those early times, Australia's colonial settlement was very much Anglican.
Oh, definitely.
Or Methodist, in the sense of flowing on from what was going on there in the 18th century. So you didn't get Catholics emerging until about 20 years after the start of the colony, because Catholics were being blocked from starting churches and things.
Yes and no. When the king wrote the letters patent, of course it was written for him to start with, that the bureaucrats and Pitt got in and designed the letters patent. At a commercial break, when I found the original handwritten letters patent to establish the legal, the political and the social system of our country, I then found someone who typed it up, and I put it in the book, because no one has ever read how our country began. I was just beside myself. But in this, there's a section where it actually is talking about that the predominant religion will be Anglican. And someone has thought about that, and they've crossed the whole section out. And I left it there and put comments on the side that made Australia open to accept all of the Christian denominations. Right from the day we started, it was open. Now, when they, about the Third Fleet, after the Third Fleet, there were so many Irish, they then allowed Catholic priests. And so the rebellion of 1804, with the Irish deciding they were going to take over the country, they were meeting after Mass on Sundays to plan their rite. So the governor, I think it was King at the time, allowed the priests to be holding Mass. So that's 1804 and 3. So even back then, there was quite a liberalism and acceptance of the Christian heritage of no matter who you were.
We could go down that rabbit hole and talk through some more of that, but we've got a plan to talk about women in Australia's history, and three, and let's hope we get a little bit of chance to talk about these women, perhaps not in as much depth as listeners might like to take advantage of reading about them, perhaps in your book. But let's start with Elizabeth Macquarie, who was married to Lachlan Macquarie, and these are such famous names, part of our history. They ought to be stories that we can all just sort of flow off our lips easily. But what was so special about Elizabeth Macquarie?
Okay, I like to talk context of who these people were. Now, Lachlan came from the island of Mull, which is off the coast of even where my people come from. It's a bit south of Skye, right? So I've been to Mull and I've been to Tobermory. The best whiskey in the world I've ever drunk comes from this island, right? But they were poor people, and many Scots put their sons into the army because it was the only way they were going to get income. And they would even sign up their children when they were born in the hope they'd get into the army. So Lachlan went out and served in India and was married, but his first wife died. So he was in his 40s, around 40s, when he met his distant cousin Elizabeth. And this is a bit confusing because she was a Campbell, and the Highlanders didn't like the Campbells because of all the business that had gone on before. So I was a bit confused about that. But he was a Presbyterian, an evangelical Presbyterian. So she must have been of the same ilk, whatever, for him to marry her, because he was aligned with the Compton Street evangelical Anglicans. He knew Wilberforce, and when he went to Australia, Wilberforce even wrote him a letter that I put in the book. So he was aligned with a new evangelical, enlightened, liberal faith about caring for people. And so Elizabeth married him. She was 26 and he was 43 or something when they got married, and came to Australia. But it's interesting because he'd been in India and was used to the sort of the way that the expats lived, of course, with all the servants. He arrived with a carriage and 6 horses, I think. You know, in the roads were awful. Well, darling, I think we're going to have to do something about the roads, I could hear him say. So it didn't take long, but they worked as a couple. Now, at this stage, and it becomes important in the other stories we're going to talk about, women didn't have really that sort of place in society, which is why Caroline is so exceptional when we get to that story. So you've got to sort of chase around with Lachlan to see where she was in all of this. So you hear that when they arrived, he decided he's going on a camping trip. He wanted to meet the locals and the Aborigines, and Elizabeth went with him. So here they were in a big tent, and they went out to Camden and the Hawkesbury, etc. And she was right there with him. Now, the big thing about Elizabeth, because Lachlan had planned and got into the greatest development in terms of what he had to do that Australia's ever experienced. He built churches and schools and asylums, and they cared for the Aborigines. It was just phenomenal. But Elizabeth was there too. And so he said to her, or she said to him, we need to do something about this city. And he said, well, go for it, love. I don't think he quite said that, but he put her in charge of actually some of the development. So the streets around Sydney and the buildings, I forget what they did, unless I look at the book myself, but she was in charge of a number of the developments and straightening out the cities and the streets. I want to think it was because the horses needed to go up and down the street. But there she was, a real part of what they were doing.
I think she had brought from England a collection of books on architecture, and it was those books that actually fueled the imaginative ideas for architecture in early Sydney.
That's right. Was it Greenway? Is that the fellow's name?
I think Francis Greenway was the architect, yes.
Yeah, so she worked with him, and as you're right, she had the books and had an idea what she was doing and studied it, so it wasn't just a track. I mean, she did all, and they did the big parks. So they did Hyde Park, the Domain, the Botanical Gardens, and of course you've still got Lady Macquarie's Chair, which you can look across to the Opera House, and all of those roads around there. She helped develop.
And so when you've got Macquarie, the name on so many streets, even interestingly, Campbelltown, just on the south side of Sydney there, is named after Elizabeth Macquarie's maiden name, Campbell.
I totally agree with you. In Pitt Town, of course, after Prime Minister Pitt, he went out that way to Pitt, was it Pitt Town? And this is when he was in his tent, and there was a fellow there that was, I don't know what he was doing, but he said, I'll give you permission and the money to build a tavern, right, and a town. And so the fellow, it's still there, called the Macquarie Arms. And so, it was just a long way up before Macquarie could get a drink, I suppose. But he said, I want you to set up a tavern.
One of those things, an accolade due here, because it was Elizabeth Macquarie whose name is on the foundation too for the Bible Society of New South Wales. She and Lachlan there, and part of the formation of that, and of course one of the oldest institutions in Australia. So yes, a name that is certainly branded into the history of Australia.
Oh yes, the asylums, of course. And it's interesting with the asylums. I mean, we sort of think it was for people who were mentally dysfunctional. That's a good word, but it wasn't. One of the asylums was for the elderly, so they were caring for the elderly. But the asylums were also for people who were intoxicated. We had a massive problem of alcohol intoxication, which we'll talk about in a while. But these were set up, and so I have statistics in the book about the fact that 20% of the Australian male adult population by the 1880s as a statistic, 20% of the population died of alcohol intoxication.
Chris, let's quickly take a call. Michael is in Maruya in New South Wales. Hey, Michael, welcome.
It's Karen, his wife.
Karen. No. Sorry, I've got something. I got a wrong note here. But Karen, what are your thoughts?
No, his wife. Love.
Oh, okay, great.
That's all right. Now, I know there'll be a lot to talk to, but for those of you, I just want to throw another name in with those beautiful ladies you're going to be talking about.
Yep. What's that name?
Mary MacKillop.
Mary MacKillop. Saint Mary MacKillop from that Roman Catholic tradition. Yes, fabulous. Any reflection from you here for Karen?
Yes, there's a great story. I think
Chris.
she started. Was she a Mercy sister?
Oh,
I think so. Let me go with Mercy until I'm corrected. Anyway, she started off in South Australia, as you may know, and came to Queensland, and she went up to not Gympie. Where did she go if it's not there? And
I'm not sure of all. Yeah, I've got a book here, and I'm not.
I'll have to look it up myself. It's in the book, but I can't remember everything.
But she grew up down in Eden.
Oh, right, did she? Well, I'm sure she was in...
South Coast on Eden in New South Wales, and
right.
Her mother, they had, I forget how many was in the family. She was nearly the eldest. Her mother was drowned or something, and she was only about 14 down there, and she had aspirations too. I think she wanted them to be religious, but I think she went out to work for the family to help because they needed, to stay together. And she went out to work, really hard work, a lot until she was older, and then she wanted to go into to be a nun, and she fought hard, from what I believe, and suffered a lot but then the time she died for children, for young ones.
Yes, she's one of many Catholics who express their faith in what they did. And I remember talking to a Mercy sister even 10, 15 years ago, and she had one bag and one change of clothes. And I mean, life for a nun was very difficult. But she went up and she did terrific work in Queensland, and I think there's still a school called the Mary MacKillop School that's up in that area. I'm just trying to think it was Gympie. But yes, she's one of those people that did a terrific job in serving this country.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I know you've got a lot to talk about. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Thank you so much, Karen. And our talkback line open on 1800 316 316. Found a little note here. She was founder of the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart, the Josephites, and a congregation of religious sisters that established a number of schools and welfare institutions throughout Australia and New Zealand with an emphasis on education and for the rural poor. And, of course, she's very highly recognised, especially in Catholic circles, because she's got that recognition as a saint. Hey, let's come back to the second of the women that we wanted to talk about today, Caroline Chisholm. Of course, her face was featured on the earlier version of the paper $5 note. So she's immortalised in Australian history because she's been on our banknotes. What are your thoughts around Caroline?
Now, here's an interesting situation. In the first story of Elizabeth Macquarie, as I was saying, she was sort of in the background when you come to read the literature because women weren't prominent in doing things. And so her husband, you read about the husband, but you've got to read that she was there with him. In the Caroline Chisholm story, it's the opposite. Caroline gets the notoriety, but it was her husband Archibald that was behind the finance and doing what they did together. and she again married a fellow that was in India. So he was with the British East India Company, and he was sick. And she started something in India as well to help with females, young women in India. When they then came out to Australia because he was sick, it didn't take them long before they were, again, because of the need, started homes to help for people coming out from Britain. Now, we've got to take another little break and say to ourselves, what's the context? Why were there so many people who independently, single people, were coming to Australia in such need? Well, we jump back to Edward Wakefield, and he'd instituted this, well, he came up with the idea, and then the Parliament instituted it, where it said free passage to Australia, and then you can buy land. So this is what was behind South Australia and how it developed. But it was for Australia generally. So all these people were now jumping on a ship without any money, just a lot of hope and opportunity written on their forehead, and they'd come out to Australia. But of course, when you got off the ship, what were you going to do? So here were all these particular women, and again, there were so many, the disproportionate relationship between the men and the women. They were being, as it were, almost sold off. So the women would be lined up, and a fellow would walk along the row and say, I'll have her and I won't, have her. But there were just women who couldn't find employment or a husband, etc. So it was this particular group that they were first centred to care for. And so it was Archibald that actually had the houses, etc. But here's another little thing about this. I did the same sort of work in South Australia, and in 5 years, I had 1,000 people come through my care in 4 households. So I'm very familiar on what you do when it comes to looking after people. Now, again, it's all right if you're just with your family, but the moment you start to share with more than a dozen people, getting hands in and out of the fridge with food that's not yours, for an example, is difficult. The beds and the clothing and all the rest of it. It's difficult to manage people in a large group. So it takes some skill. So I've stopped to think about this. So she had a lot of volunteers that were helping them, and their main thing was to get people employment or get them whatever they wanted to do, was it married or whatever, etc. So it was short-term accommodation. But she looked after, she and Archibald, 40,000 people in some 20 years. It was a phenomenal journey of care. But again, they were Catholic.
That's an interesting dimension too, isn't it? And just to not sugarcoat this, because you had young women arriving on our shores in Australia, penniless and homeless, and rather than finding a place to sleep on the street, you had Caroline Chisholm, who was on the lookout for them, because if they were not in some ways cared for young women in particular, prostitution was likely to be their profession. So she was saving these young women from perhaps what we might consider a lifestyle that would have been detrimental to their futures. And so there were a lot of young men too who were originally those settlers. They were looking for wives. So it was advantageous to be the matchmaker in some sense. Take these young women to rural communities because they were young men looking for wives. That's
exactly correct. But it didn't take them long before they realised it wasn't just women that were arriving and were homeless. They then started to also care for young men. Now, they went off to England. I forget the reason why they went back to England. Elizabeth toured the country and gave lectures. Now, that is an outstanding thing. Again, remember that women didn't talk in public, but here she was being accepted and even spoke to the House of Lords. Well, they raised enough money, but Archibald took his own money and leased ships, and Caroline fitted them out. And they were going around England promoting Australia, 3 meals a day, sunshine, laying around the golden sands. They were really promoting coming to Australia. And I was sort of scratching my head wondering why there were so many problems. But here they were encouraging. Then Archibald went back to Sydney to receive all these people that were on the boats that they'd paid for themselves. They would not take government money and they did not take church money. And they supported all their work by themselves.
In fact, before we go any further, Christopher, let's take a call. Benji is in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. Hey, Benji, welcome.
Hello.
Hey, Benji, what are your thoughts?
I'd just like to say, thank you for, this sort of talk, because it makes us, appreciate who the people that gone before us and the godly people who make things happen, so that we can have this country, this blessed country that we live in.
Yes, thank you for recognising that, Benji. Thoughts here from our guest, Christopher, for Benji?
Well, in the Blue Mountains, there's a good subject. You know that when Macquarie had them, Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson, up the Blue Mountains, which was actually led by Hamilton Hume, a 19-year-old that showed these toffs how to get up the mountain. But when the road was there, that it was actually Lachlan and Elizabeth in the coach that went up over the Blue Mountains. And she was right there in amongst all of what was going on at the time of the development of New South Wales.
Benji, are you across any of that history?
Well. There's Wilberforce up there as well.
Wilberforce was back in in Britain, so he's probably a little bit out of context here. Further thought from you, Christopher?
Oh yes, so we've got a Wilberforce comes a little bit later than what we're talking about. We're talking about 1815. So Wilberforce comes to notoriety in the 1830s, particularly when it came to Wilberforce. Edward, I'm thinking of Wakefield, I'm on the wrong topic there. Yeah, wrong person. Wilberforce's influence, of course, was great, but he's in England. He's not really influencing, unless, of course, through the connections that Lachlan had in England with the Compton Street community.
Nevertheless, someone with such a wonderful historic achievement as Wilberforce and his influence on early Australian colony are just absolutely amazing. Benji in the Blue Mountains, thank you so much for your call. Let's get on to Daisy Bates, because here's the third of the women that we decided we would talk about today. An Irish-Australian journalist, welfare worker, self-taught anthropologist. Give us your Daisy Bates thoughts.
All right, Daisy. I am most impressed with Daisy Bates. I'd never heard of her until I started this research. But in her 20s, an Irish woman, her last name was O'Dwyer, Daisy O'Dwyer, and she came out on a ship to Townsville. And I thought, Townsville? You can imagine Townsville in the 1880s. Unbelievable. And so she must have already been somehow known or invited or pledged or something to marry Morant. What was his first name? Apart from he was a breaker of horses.
He was Harry
Morant.
Breaker Morant.
Yeah, so everybody probably knows of Harry Breaker Morant because of the famous movie. But he was a breaker of horses, but he was also a breaker of hearts, because he was in trouble within a matter of months. He got picked up or something, stealing a pig and falsifying checks. So the marriage with Daisy didn't last long. It lasted less than a year. And so there she was by herself. But she then went and married the fellow Bates, who was also a drover. So she went from, one drover to the next. I don't know if she was if that was a step up or not, being a drover's wife. But anyway, so there she was in Queensland. But she went back to England, and it was there that she went to work for a newspaper, and she became a journalist. She learnt journalism. And it was in that period that she was reading something about the mistreatment of Aborigines in Western Australia. And so she got finance to come out and actually do some research. And then she got money from a Western Australian newspaper to continue that research. So that's how she ends up in the Nation.
So in some sense, Daisy Bates becomes really the first person, and when she's classified as an anthropologist, to be able to have these reflections on early Aboriginal culture.
Yeah.
And so she was across all of those things, Aboriginal life and history and culture and rights and beliefs and customs.
Yes, and on the boat out, on the ship out from England, she talks to a priest, because I forgot to say that she's also a Catholic woman coming from England. And she talks to the priest, and the priest introduces her to the bishop when they get to Perth. And the bishop takes her up to Broome, and then a bit further north to a mission that they've got. And it was at that point that she becomes interested in helping the Aborigines. And so She then gets more finance from somewhere to do anthropological studies. But she learns the language, and even in Broome, she sat and wrote down 2,000 Aboriginal words. She just had a yen for languages. And so she just started in on helping the Aborigines right from the start. So she didn't return. I think her husband, Bates, came up, and at this age they had a child, Archie. And so she then spent time going from Broome back to Perth with a herd of cattle. But she decided by the time she got to Perth that a drover's wife was not for her. And so off she went to actually live and care for the Aborigines.
And she did this self-financing the support for Aboriginal people. I've got a little note here that she was setting up camps to feed and to clothe and to nurse the transient Aboriginal people, drawing on her own income to meet the needs of those who were ageing.
Yeah, those were ageing. And she lived in a tent. She lived in a tent, firstly, to do some studies for 4 years before she re-emerged. And then she lived in a tent with an Aboriginal tribe on the border of South Australia and Western Australia. I should know the name of the place. Starts with an O. Someone will correct me in a minute. But she lived in the tent for 18 years. And one of her main interests, if that's the way to put it, was that she was out to try and keep Aboriginal women away from marrying white men. Now, we've got to stop and ask a question, because there was a railway line and the women would run down, the Aboriginal women, and say, please take me, please take me. And she was down there sort of trying to drive them back to keep the tribe pure. And at that point, you've got to say, why? Well, here's the thing. We're talking about a Stone Age society living out in the elements, the wind and the rain and raw food, etc., etc. And so, I mean, living in white settlements was extremely attractive. And then by 1901, when they did the first census of Australia, the censor himself takes time to look at the Aboriginal cohort they looked at, and he said 95% of even those people who identify as Aboriginal, 95%, were of mixed blood. Only 5% of people who were identified as Indigenous were full-blood Aboriginal. There was such a movement of integration that we don't appreciate, and Daisy Bates was trying her best to keep the tribe that she was involved with native. Important
and fascinating to be able to think about that in our early colonial cultural history, where there was a woman who was such a champion of the Aboriginal people that she wanted to have them resist this cross interaction. In fact, as I understand it from a note that's coming to memory, is that she recognised that people who were half-caste, mixed blood, were actually not treated well on either side, and they became worthless to society, and that's why she was trying to resist that and trying to keep the Aboriginal bloodline more pure.
Yeah, a few words on that. You see, an Aboriginal person or tribe have two totems. One for their tribe and another one, mother and father, and because of their religion, pantheism, then it was going to be a rock or an animal or a plant. So the moment a child was born to a non-Aboriginal, then they didn't have the two totems. So the tribe was out to kill, if they could, that child or even the mother, which is another story that comes out of a woman in Tasmania, without me going there. So yes, Daisy could recognise that the children and even the mothers were going to be put out of the tribe and not accepted within white society either. So this is how you got the large communities of mixed blood people living on the edge of towns that we still, I think, have across the country.
Another little note I've got here, that she is said to have worn pistols.
Oh, you really
she's a gun-toting woman. And so even into her older age, she was quite prepared to use the pistol, not on the Aboriginal people, but on police, because if they came to mistreat her Aborigines, she was prepared to defend them, even carrying arms.
Yeah, and she was made an Aboriginal by the process of adoption, and she was made a protector of several tribes and became the only woman to be a Justice of the Peace in both Queensland, in Western Australia and South Australia. Now, this was really something incredible for a woman to receive these positions, to be the protector. So she was actually introduced to royalty. I've got to think of the Duke when he came out. You probably can tell me who it was. And also I believe that she was introduced to King George and his wife Mary at one stage. She spoke to a royal commission or something in New South Wales, and there's a terrific story of her with a camel getting across the Nullarbor Plain till she could get to Port Augusta and get on the train, and then travelled up to Sydney and back again. And here's this woman with a camel walking across the Nullarbor Plain, which is a phenomenal influence. But she is eventually, and all the research I did in 120 years, I didn't come across anyone that was awarded even an MBE, a member of the British Empire, but she was awarded the Commander, a CBE, for her phenomenal work living and helping the Aborigines. She was a phenomenal woman. Can I read you something? This is a really tear-jerking story. When she died, in 1940, Mary Coles wrote in the Australian Women's Weekly, for 40 years, Daisy has sat by native campfires collecting legends and customs of the fast-vanishing tribes of Australia. She has devoted her private fortune to their welfare. She speaks 188 dialects. She discovered the bush and its primitive people from as far north as Fitzroy River in the Northern Territory to Uldea on the vast Nullarbor Plains. Mrs. Bates carried water from the river to her camp. She tended the sick and hunted for food for the blind. Great chiefs sought her counsel. Mrs. Bates never attempted to change the religious beliefs or native habits of the Aborigines, but when they were dying, she comforted them with the words, "When you let go my hand, my father will take your hand." The value of her ethnological and anthropological research cannot be assessed in money. Among the 270 articles Bates wrote on a number of different topics, Daisy Bates died in a nursing home in Prospect in 1951, but a phenomenal 188 dialects she spoke and 270 articles she published.
And for those who want to take that a little deeper, to read some more about Daisy Bates, and you might want to get a hold of Christopher's book, but she was convinced that the Aboriginal people were a dying race, and she believed that her mission was to record as much as she could before they disappeared. Now, that might be a reflection on the chaotic state of that animist religious Aboriginal peoples where she was serving. That's very challenging to think of that, isn't it? Because she's controversially known to be able to have recorded, practices like infanticide and cannibalism in those Aboriginal peoples. So she didn't hold back. She wasn't trying to sugarcoat anything. She was painting a picture of Aboriginal people in those early colonial years.
Yeah, she was accepted into the anthropological societies, if I got that right, if that's the phrase, in both Britain and Australia, which again was a phenomenal achievement. For her work was recognised, because I don't think she was degreed or didn't belong to the Royal Society. She wasn't aristocratic, but it was the content of her work that rose to the attention of people in these societies, and her recognition for her phenomenal work.
Let's talk some more about perhaps some other women, and we've got to focus this hour on women who helped shape Australia, and certainly talking about those women and their Christian faith, where they're coming from, what sort of motivations they have there. When we talk about the epidemic problem that you mentioned a little earlier, rum taking its toll, 1 in 5 dying from alcohol poisoning, those early days, alcohol in Australia, as I understand it, alcohol almost caused our colony to collapse. It almost didn't happen at all because of the alcohol problem. But there were women particularly who came to the fore over the decades and the next century ahead, who led temperance movements, who drew attention to the challenges and tried to steer young people in the right direction so that they wouldn't be overcome by this alcohol tragedy. Your thoughts here on temperance leagues and women who are a part of those things?
Right, and we've talked about 2 Catholic women, but now we actually have a movement in Victoria that starts, and there were so many pubs, and as you point out, the alcohol intoxication was just incredible. And women, evangelical women from not the major denominations, went door to door to try and get women to sign a petition to do something about the incredible alcohol consumption. Anyway, they got enough signatures that they then approached the governor of Victoria and said, slapped all these names and papers on the desk and said, we want you to close the pubs. And so that the governor was forced to. I've got a picture in the book of all these women in their massive, terrific hats, and it was so overwhelming. I could just see the governor sitting there saying, well, all right, what else do you want? That they were really quite impressive. So, yes, they then asked that the councils, that somehow the women and the councils could have the right to limit the number of pubs. So as this was taking off and these women were forced into the limelight, remember that it was a big move for women who were not accepted to speak in public and even were afraid to talk in public. But it had to be done because at this stage, and it continues, of course, where women understood themselves as their role in the homes. They would marry early and men were encouraged to find a job to be able to look after their families. So for women to step out of that cultural routine to become speakers and to advocate, firstly, for the temperance movement and then to push for the vote was really something for women in this country. Remember, it starts in this country in terms of pushing for the vote.
Interesting connection here that maybe in other conversations people won't draw attention to, but in our conversation we will, because they were Christian temperance movements.
It was a Christian movement, fully a Christian movement, and so was therefore the movement for women to get the vote was a Christian movement, and we have totally lost sight of women seeking their rights and seeking equality. So by the time we get into the 1890s, Australia has women with equal rights to men, and we were one of the first countries in the world to actually do that, and it's something we've forgotten.
Reflecting on our Christian history here, because women were ideologically most suited to serving in the home, and it was the men's responsibility to do those issues around justice and governance and, those are the important ways you'd run the country. So this was something, too, that came from a Christian ideological background, too, that women were not promoted as significantly for social action. So question for you here, sometimes women who acted there and in the Christian temperance leagues and then went on to push for the vote, sometimes were doing those things outside of the imprimatur of the church saying, well done, women. Any thoughts here?
Oh, yes. There's no doubt about that. I mean, again, the church was in the format of this is what we do around here. The culture was. And women had their place in the home, and you should raise the children, and there's not a problem with that, except that women do have capabilities and certainly can contribute to their family, their society, and to our political development. There's no doubt about that, but it still had to be done. And still it was Christian women. Now, let me just say something. When I approached this whole topic as a Christian, I was determined to look for things that Christians did. Now, I didn't write a book that's covered on every page about what Christians did, but I came at it looking for the context of these people, and that's why we're discussing them today, because there is no doubt that the motivation for care, whether it was for the Aborigines, the homeless, whether it was to do something about society, was motivated by Christian faith. And we need more of it today.
We're about to draw our conversation to a close. Are there any women's names that come to mind so far as the temperance movement or the suffrance leading to the vote? I've got a couple here that you might be familiar with. Names like Frances Deborah Levy or Ada Constance Duncan. I've got a name here, Mary Lee and Elizabeth Webb Nichols. I guess maybe they're not going to be as prominent as a Daisy Bates or an Elizabeth Macquarie. Those sorts of names, they are standing head and shoulders above. But there are lots of names in there of those Christian women who were very activist in the way that they were campaigning for sobriety and also then for the vote for women.
Now, here's something else that this is sort of a byline in this story, and that is that the women were getting help for prominent men. And I put in a list of the men who said, I'm going to get you the opportunity to speak. So it wasn't just the women, waving placards, etc., outside the doors. They were still being helped by those that could see the sense of what they were doing. So yes, there are a number of prominent women that were doing things, but there's also those men that put their shoulder behind the wheel to help them in this event.
Well, Christopher, always fascinating hearing these stories and just being able to tap in. And I know just on a shallow level, because there's so much more depth that listeners will be able to go to when they get a hold of your book. Your book is called What a Capital Idea, Australia 1770 to 1901. And you're able to get that at all good online booksellers. Or you might want to connect with Christopher at his website. And I don't know whether he does signed copies specially. Do you? Do you do those? If someone sort of contact you and say, I want a signed copy. Christopher, I don't want just one off the website.
Well, I'm doing 30 speaking engagements in the next 6 months. So the whole project and what I'm talking about has become incredibly popular. When I get a chance there, I'm signing people's copies. It's a bit difficult to do it online, but if you get me on the right day, I will. But you've only got to look up What a Capital Idea. Just put those words into the internet. It'll bring you straight to the book.
And you can also just Google Christopher Reynolds, and he has a website too, reynoldlearning.com, reynoldlearning.com. Christopher, let's do this again sometime soon, but thanks so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and your heart with us once again today on 2020.
Thank you very much, Nell.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.